Welcome back. Today we're talking about Mind Night Blue, First Night with a Bampire. And yes, you heard me correct, Bampire with a B. And this is by LB Harpdog. First, I'm going to start off with saying, do not come for me in the comments if I pronounce any of these names wrong. You are soon going to learn that no matter what, I am always going to pronounce a name wrong. This was an author recommended book for me, which basically just means exactly that. The author reached out and asked me to read and review their book. The author did tell me that I would probably end up rating this 2 or 3 stars because of how much schmut there is in this book. But I'm going to let y'all decide that on yourselves. As of right now, this is the only book I've read. I do know that there are 3 books out right now. And I also know that this series is supposed to be 6 books long. And apparently each one goes further and further into a storyline. At least I'm hoping. Now remember that any information I give you is from an e-book version, not a physical book version. So the book I read was a 2023 revision book, but the book was originally copyrighted in 2019. When you look on Amazon and Goodreads, both of them have the same blurb. I will not read you the whole blurb because, you could do that yourself. But I'll give you a little sneak peek. A dark and twisted world where self-gratification, lust, desires, mystery, and emotions are all mixed up in a messy love triangle. Or should I say, love pentagon. I'm intrigued. Vampires are not your ordinary vampires. These creatures live in a world where rules don't apply to them. Their society runs strictly on pleasures and sweet-tasting blood that allows them to walk among humans on Earth. These vampires are from a planet off-world called Bamptilia? Don't come for me. And crashed on Earth to escape oppression and domination. Trust me, I'm really hoping that description is for the whole series because that description is not for book 1. I shouldn't say it's not for book 1. I should say we get this much of that description in book 1. But again, I'll let you judge. On Amazon, this book has 15 ratings with a 3.4 star average. On Goodreads, this has 12 ratings with 8 written reviews and a 3.5 star average. When I made all those reviews and counted up the star average, that did not include my own rating, but you'll find out my rating at the end of the video. Let's get started talking about this book. The first thing I'm going to tell you when starting this book is to remember it's an ebook version. Alright? And the big thing I'm going to say is start this ebook version from the very, very beginning. Like, start it all the way to the cover if you need to, because what I'm about to explain might sound a little weird because I've never seen it before. I'm sure several hundreds of you have probably already seen it before, but I have not. So when you start from the beginning, there is, the table of contents, all of that stuff is it, the copyright, all that's in there, right? But this author says to listen to music at certain points within the book so you can understand the characters' mindsets better and understand what is going, like the feelings that are going on through the story. Now the author does list the playlist in the ebook version. It's there. But they also link a Spotify music list in the ebook version. So you can play it whenever you need to. The author also makes a warning that this book should not be read in public I fully agree. They warn that it's very erotic. I did not find a trigger warning page for the book, but I did find a book trailer page. There's your trailers. Apparently the author has trailers for this book, so you can kind of see what you're getting into and I guess learn a little bit about what's going on. The links are clickable in the ebook version, and you can also just type them in. The prologue for this book is your hook. It had me immediately ready to read the rest of this book. I was like, oh yeah, this is fire, right away. But then when into chapter 1, we end up in a library meeting Juju. And yes, I think it's pronounced Juju because it's spelled J-U-J-U. I could be wrong, but we're going to say Juju. While she's in the library, she meets this mystery man. Or more like the mystery man comes up and introduces himself. But this is where I have a little problem with this chapter, because in this chapter, while they are talking, in the book, it's mentioned LB, then mystery man, then LB, then mystery man, and somehow we know this mystery man's name is LB before he gave it to us or before we even asked. So I know y'all are gonna come after me like, you know, that's such a tiny thing to nitpick about. Well, it drove me nuts. Okay, get over yourselves. It just didn't make sense to me how we were calling the guy LB, then mystery man, and then back to LB, and then back to mystery man. It just didn't make sense. But yes, I'm aware. It's a small thing, doesn't really matter. It just messed with me when I read it. Anyway, Juju and LB are in the library. They're getting acquainted. And LB is fascinated with mind games. And his big thing is he likes to ask questions that require you to truly think. Like, these aren't questions you can just spout off answers. You actually have to think. So the questions are going back and forth between her and JB. Sorry, her and LB. Excuse me. They're going back and forth. And then Juju makes a comment about wanting to meet a vampire. And of course, LB tells her that when they meet again, he can make that wish come true on 2 conditions. She has to wear a black silk evening dress and bring along 1 sex toy of her choosing. Yeah, you heard me say that. LB leaves her to decide what she wants to do. She packs up, she goes home. Juju goes home for a little physical reprieve. Hint, hint, I'm sure you can put 2 and 2 together. Well, during this little reprieve, the author gifts us with a little show while Juju takes care of herself. And the show deals with a couple and the babysitter. I gotta tell you, by the end of chapter 1, I went from, ooh, what the hell's gonna happen, to what the hell is happening? Because between the prologue and chapter 1, it was like, excuse me? 2 very different things. So in chapter 2, we finally end up in, I guess, another realm. But we end up in Mind Night Blue. It's where all the vampires, excuse me, not vampires, vampires exist. But no, I will not tell you how LB and Juju got there. You have to read it, and it's a very interesting way to cross the threshold. While we're there, LB starts his Education 101 for vampires. We do learn some interesting facts, some interesting things, but I like how LB tells us that it's not vampire with a V, it's vampire with a B, And he tells us why this is. Apparently it was sexier in movies to have a V. I'm sorry, but that part was great. I loved it. LB goes on to tell us about how he and his kind came to Earth. Granted, he doesn't actually tell us like the reason why they left the planet until later in the book, but he explains how they ended up crash landing, and that explains the prologue. While he's explaining things, he tells us, like I said, how they arrived on Earth. He explains more of the educations and the histories, and he explains how his kind have all passed on, and how he and only one other, who he refers to as the attacker, by the way, the attacker's female, go her. But he refers to how they're the only two left of the original kind. Juju asks what has happened to the attacker, and LB goes off on pretty much a tangent, explaining what happened, his interactions with her, and everything else. And he basically admits that he forced himself on her, and that after it was all done, you know, after she kicked his ass at the end of it, how he felt shame and guilt. And yeah, I do say basically, but read the book to understand what I'm saying. He says that that incident is the reason why he is the way he is now, and then decides he wants to take Juju on a tour of the castle. Granted, we don't really see much of the castle in this book, but we see one very interesting room. It is the mindfuck room, and that is where we are heading. If you heard mindfuck room, you heard right. It's literally where vampires mindfuck female humans. And they don't even have to be female, they can be male as well, but most of them are females in the area. But here's the kicker. They're all virgins as well. Apparently, it's a better meal for these vampires. Yeah, it sounds like incubi to me, but you know. While we're in the room, LB does some more Education 101, explaining things, asking questions, verifying, all of the whole nine. You're going to learn that LB likes to talk a lot. But while we're in the room, LB lets Juju touch the humans, who are also known as life slaves. And when she touches them, she can see their mindfuck fantasy. Well, LB is also touching her, you know, on the shoulder. Like, you know, he has his hand on her shoulder. So not only can she see, he can see how she's reacting to it. When she found out that LB was seeing her reaction to the fantasy, she got all embarrassed. However, LB was impressed. He said, and I quote directly from the book, that she has an appetite that even the gods might not know how to feed. I'm sorry, but I personally love that quote. An appetite the gods don't know how to feed. Girl. While they're still in that room, Juju asks why they just don't have sex with the virgins. And LB goes into explaining why it's very dangerous for a vampire and a virgin human to have sex. When she asks what he means, of course he has to show her. The first thing LB shows Juju is his experience with a human virgin female. It happens to be the one and only person he's ever loved. Then he goes on to showing her the attacker's experience and what he thinks actually happened. I can tell you that these two experiences are very detailed and very, very intense. After LB has shown her these two experiences, he decides it's time to take Juju further into the castle and he takes her to a restaurant that's within the castle to order food. And yes, I do actually mean real food. After they've ordered the food, Juju puts kind of like two and two together and realizes that the two stories end in two opposite different directions. Like, one ends in death and the other one ends up with changing the human into a vampire. So she asks how this happens. LB gives his thoughts on it, but doesn't really know why. He just says, this is what I think. Then Juju's curiosity gets piqued even more. And I think the reason why she asks, how did the attacker, who is female, turn female humans into vampires? And the only reason I think that she asked this question is because all the vampires that are in Mind Night Blue are her creations, are the attacker's creations. So anyways, Juju asks, and of course, LB has to show. And again, very detailed, very intense. So while they're still eating, Juju is still asking questions, and then she asks how vampires reproduce. How she got onto this question, I'm not actually sure. But instead of answering, LB goes into talking about how they find their mates, and if they don't find their mates, they go into what's called game of hunting. Now, I will say that LB does mention how they produce offspring later in the book, but he does say that the mating, the game, the offspring, and all of that can only happen on his planet. So of course, because LB mentioned the game of hunting, Juju now wants to know all about it. LB is reluctant at first to tell her about it because of how gruesome it is, but eventually breaks down. He doesn't just tell her, he shows her, of course, in vivid detail and intensity. He shows her his experience with the games. And when he's done showing her, he explains that those are the reasons, well, one of the many reasons that he and his kind left their planet for somewhere new. Apparently, after LB had showed her his experience in the game of hunting, her sex-addled brain went off the charts. Like, she becomes sex crazed, she becomes lust-driven, all of that. So LB has to take her back to the mindfuck room, give her a mindfuck fantasy where she can get off and actually have some symbionts of sanity to continue hanging out at Mind Night Blue and learning about vampires. Yeah. Her fantasy is wild, dude. Anyways, after she gets off and, has some sanity back into her, a few things happen around the castle. She meets a vampire, she ends up in the garden, she does this, she does that. I'm not telling you, read the book. Trust me, it's interesting. You should. Yeah, it's interesting. But she wants to see more of the area. So she asks LB to take her physically somewhere. So they go. LB takes her on this little adventure. They go sightseeing. And eventually she wants something sweet. So he takes her to an ice cream parlor. And if I remember correctly, it is called the Sweet Fang Parlor. Where Juju is, of course, surprised that not everything is either not covered in blood or not flavored with blood. While they're at the parlor, LB gets a phone call and he has to go away. It's an emergency. He has to take it. He has to go work. And she just wants to hang out and eat her ice cream and just chill. He tells him to go. She'll be here when he comes back. Even though he's hesitant to leave her, he still does. While he's gone, another female vampire comes in, sees her, finds out she's with LB, and, well, pretends to be nice. Her name is Lady, and she convinces Juju that to leave with her and that she will take her to go see more sights. I'm not going to tell you what happens after this, because after this, the book got 100 times more interesting. And I definitely think you have to read it for yourself. So that's the end of our little synopsis of the book. I highly recommend you go read it. But I am going to say that even though I could not find a trigger warning page for my version of the book, I did notice that a chapter had it, like right when you start the chapter, there was a little trigger warning that said, you know, if you can't handle these, skip this chapter. Personally, for me, I have yet to find a book that I'm really triggered by, but I can see the triggers that would affect other people. Personally, I think this book, being such a hardcore erotica, should have a trigger warning page that encompasses the whole book, because there's a lot of parts within the book that I can definitely see people being triggered at. I know some of you are going to come on here and be like, authors aren't required to do it. You know, if you can't handle these types of books, don't read them, blah, blah, blah. I get that. And you're right. Authors do have the right to not put trigger warnings in, especially when they are saying this is a hardcore erotica. It is this, you know. I just think, personally, it's not a bad thing to have. Now, I did end up rating this book 3 stars. Only because I really had no idea how to rate this book. This book confused the living hell out of me. And I just didn't know how to rate it. So I gave it a 3. I can say without a single doubt that I am not the target audience for this book. While I do like supernatural books, genres, and all of that, and yes, I read novellas and novelettes that have smut, you know, just for smut purposes, this was such a different level of smut for me that it just this book is a very intense book. It is hardcore erotica. If you cannot stand hardcore erotica, I would not read this. However, if you like hardcore erotica, please read this book because you will absolutely love it. But for me, the amount of smut in this book was just it wasn't just a little, okay? It was a lot too much for me. For me. And I know there's supposed to be a storyline in this book, but I feel like I completely missed it. Like, I feel like there was so much smut that I couldn't grasp the storyline. Like, I know I just kind of reviewed the book with you, but I feel like I told you more about where you could find the smut in the book than what the hell was actually going on in the book. As of right now, I do not see myself finishing this series. Now, there's 2 reasons why. One is because I am massively confused and shocked on what the hell I just read. And 2, because I'd rather wait to read the rest of the series till all 6 books are out and I can purchase them. Because I feel like even though I missed something in the first book, or at least I feel like I missed something in the first book, it might get answered, you know, throughout the rest of the series. So we'll see if I actually get around to finishing it or not. So my question for you, have you read this book? What did you think? If you haven't read this book, would you, based on what you've heard? Remember, no nasty or hate comments. Reading is subjective. And I'll see you next time for episode 3. Later, y'all.